Millionaire said, I need a boyfriend to meet my parent this week. Single dad said, not sleeping on the sofa. Before we begin the story, don't forget to follow Tender Bonds. Like and share our story. The toolbox was on the porch when Silas got the call. Miller's old red Craftsman, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in that particular shade since Reagan, its lid rusted half shut and one latch replaced with a loop of wire. He'd meant to move it. It sat on the porch boards through all of December while he'd told himself the ground was too frozen to dig a proper spot behind the barn. And this was true enough that he didn't have to look at the other truth, which was that the toolbox was the last thing of Miller's he hadn't distributed or donated or packed away into the dark of a closet. He was eating chili from the pot, 3 days old, on the stove, not worth the bowl, when his phone lit up with a Columbus number he didn't know. He picked up because Miller had told him once, before the black ice and the 2 a.m. and the highway that changed everything, that a man who stops answering the phone has already decided something about himself. Silas hadn't decided that yet, or was trying not to. Silas Prout. The voice on the line was composed in the way of people who are paid to be composed. My name is Cass Beaumont. I'm Miller's cousin. He left me your number. Silas set the spoon in the chili. I know who you are. Miller had mentioned her. My Columbus cousin, he'd say, which covered everything and nothing, and then he'd grin at Silas the way he did when he was leaving something out on purpose. Then I'll be direct, she said. My father's had 2 cardiac events in 3 months. My mother has finally agreed to let me come home this weekend on the condition that I come. She used the word settled. That's her word. It means I need to bring someone. I had arranged for Miller to come. He was going to pretend we were going to say we were together. My parents met him twice. They liked him. A pause, precisely calibrated. I realize this is a cold call. I realize how this sounds. I'm prepared to pay for your time. That last sentence landed in the kitchen and sat there. I'm a drywall contractor, Silas said, not a whatever this is. I know what you are, Miller told me. What did Miller tell you? Another pause, this one less calibrated. He said you were the most capable man he'd ever met and that you didn't know what to do with that when it wasn't being used. She let that settle. He also said you hadn't been anywhere since your wife left. Silas looked out the window at the back pasture, brown and frost-hard and going dark. When do you need an answer? Tonight would be helpful. I've got a daughter. She goes where I go. That's a beat. That's fine. And I'm not sleeping on a sofa. He said it plainly. Whatever arrangement this is, I'm not the thing that gets folded up and put away at night. Silence on the line. Then in a different register, there's a guest room. All right, he said. He found the building on a Friday morning in Columbus. A converted Pennzoil warehouse in the short north that some architect had turned into 16 units at prices Silas had no equivalent for. The lobby had 14-foot ceilings, exposed industrial trusses, and a single orchid on the concierge desk that probably cost more than his electric bill. He stood in it with Joni beside him, 9 years old, brown-haired, holding a library book about birds, and waited while the elevator descended with the particular silence of machinery that has never been asked to hurry. Cass Beaumont opened the door of 4C, and Silas understood, in the way of a man who has spent 20 years estimating square footage and finish grade, that the apartment was worth somewhere in the neighborhood of $900,000. Floor-to-ceiling windows, poured concrete counters, a kitchen that had a pot-filler faucet and a range with 6 burners, and a shelf of cookbooks that were organized by region and had clearly been used. On the dining table, spread across 3 feet of surface, architectural drawings, red-lined and annotated, with a takeout container pushed to the corner and a coffee cup using a rolled elevation as a coaster. She was in dark trousers and a gray cashmere pullover, and her hair was up, and she was looking at Silas, the way people look at someone they've been told about, but are still quietly recalibrating against the reality of. "You're taller than I expected," she said. "What did Miller say?" "He said you were average height." Miller was 5'8". Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. Close enough. She stepped back from the door and held it wide, and Joni walked in first, already looking at the windows, and Silas stepped in behind her and the door closed. The apartment had 3 problems, and Silas found all 3 in the first 20 minutes without trying. The kitchen faucet had a quarter turn of play before it engaged, which meant the cartridge was going. The baseboard heater in the hallway was ticking on a thermal cycle that indicated a partially blocked fin. And the guest room, his room, had a window latch that hadn't been locked in some time, visible from the cant of the metal, and the paint that had sealed it at a slight gap. He mentioned none of this. He set his bag on the chair and sat on the bed to test the frame, and it was a good frame, solid, queen-sized, with a headboard that was real walnut and not veneer. He ran his thumb along the joint where the headboard met the rail. Good joinery. Someone had cared about this piece. He heard Cass in the kitchen, filling the French press. Heard Joni's voice, asking about something. Then Cass's voice answering, lower. And then a pause, and then Joni's voice again with that specific tone she used when an adult had said something genuinely interesting rather than interesting for a child. He sat on the bed for a moment longer and looked at the window and the gray January sky behind it. Then he went to the kitchen. Cass had poured Joni a glass of orange juice and was leaning against the counter with her own coffee, and the two of them were looking at the architectural drawings on the table. "It's going to be a library," Cass was saying. "There used to be a factory here. These," she pointed to a section of the drawing, "are the original load-bearing columns. We're keeping them." "Do they hold up the roof?" Joni asked. "They do. So if you took one out, the whole thing would fall." "If you took the right one, yes." Joni considered this. "Which one is the right one?" Cass looked up and caught Silas watching from the doorway. The faintest thing passed between them, not yet anything you could call by name. "That's the first thing you have to figure out," Cass said. He noticed it more on the drive to Kashakton the next morning. The way her car was a 10-year-old Volvo wagon with a cracked center console and a trunk full of rolled drawings, which did not track with the apartment, and he filed this away. The way she ordered gas station coffee and drank it without complaint. The way she kept her feet flat on the floor the whole drive, very still, like someone who had learned that stillness was armor. "My parents don't know about the firm," she said, somewhere past Hebron. "They know I do architecture. They don't know the scale of it." "Why not?" "Because my father built houses for 40 years with his hands." She looked at the road. "And I design buildings that cost more than his entire neighborhood, and I've never swung a hammer in my life, and I cannot explain to him how that happened without it sounding like I think I'm better than him, which I don't, but it sounds that way." Silas said nothing for a while. Then, "You want me to be the blue-collar buffer." "I want you to be a person I'm with who happens to work with his hands." She paused. "Miller was a machinist. It worked. My father talked to him about torque specifications for 45 minutes at Christmas." The present tense hit the air, and she felt it, and he felt her feel it. "He talked to him," she corrected quietly. "I can talk about torque specifications." She looked at him then, a real look, and he kept his eyes on the highway. "For the record," she said, "I'm not I know what I asked you to do, the boyfriend performance. My mother just needs to see, she needs to not see me alone. Once she sees I'm not alone, she stops watching me, and I can actually check on my dad." She turned back to the window. "I don't need you to hold my hand. I don't need you to be convincing. I just need you to be present." "I can do that," Silas said. Joni said from the back seat, without looking up from her book, "You've been holding hands since the gas station." Neither of them said anything. Then Silas looked down and Cass looked down, and their hands were in fact resting side by side on the console, not quite touching and not quite not touching, in the manner of two people who have reached an agreement their bodies understand before they do. Cass moved her hand into her lap. Silas kept his eyes on the road. Deb Beaumont was a man in the late diminishment of a large life. He'd been big, the bones showed it still, but the cardiac events had done what time alone doesn't always do. They'd made him careful with himself. He shook Silas's hand at the door, and the grip told Silas everything about the grip it used to be. He held on an extra second, appraising. "Miller said you do drywall," Deb said. "Drywall finish, some structural, whatever comes." "You do your own taping." "I do my own taping." Deb released his hand, satisfied by something. "I never could tape worth a damn," he said, which in the language of men who build things meant, "You're all right." Trace Beaumont was small and fast and had a way of surveying a room that missed nothing and commented on nothing it saw, storing it all for later. She looked at Joni and said, "How hungry are you?" which was not a question, and took her to the kitchen before anyone had got their coats off. By the time Silas and Cass and Deb were in the living room, the sounds from the kitchen were already domestic, drawers opening, Joni asking, Trace explaining. And the house had that quality a house gets when children are in it, and it remembers what it was built for. Cass sat beside Silas on the couch, close but not close, and her father started asking him about a retaining wall he'd been planning for the back slope. And Silas leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and talked about drainage and deadmen and the particular frost heave problems of this county's clay soil. And he could feel Cass beside him, not performing anything, just breathing, in a way she hadn't breathed since Columbus. The pipe went Saturday night. They were at dinner when it happened, all five of them at a table set for what it had been, with Trace's good dishes and a roast that had been cooking since morning. Deb was talking about a neighbor's barn renovation, gesturing with his fork, and then from the utility room came the sound of a sweated joint finally surrendering, a hollow bang, then water, fast and decisive and going somewhere it had no business going. Deb was up before Silas could register the sound fully, but his left leg gave at the knee and he caught the table edge, and the pain crossed his face like weather, and he sat back down and looked at the table and said nothing, and the nothing he said cost him something visible. Silas was in the utility room in 4 seconds. The copper coupling behind the water heater had let go at the solder, old work, not bad work, just finished. Water was crossing the concrete toward the door. He went to one knee and found the shutoff under the heater and turned it, and the water slowed and stopped. He was lying on his back on the cold floor with his hand bleeding from the copper edge and looking at the underside of the heater, and he was not thinking about anything metaphorical. He was thinking, half-inch copper, sweat fitting, I need flux and a torch, and a trip to whatever's open in Kashakton at 7 a.m. He was thinking, I know how to fix this. He was thinking, I always know how to fix things, and I have been so careful about whose things I fix. That last thought arrived without invitation, the way cold does from the ground up, and he didn't pursue it. Cass came to the doorway. She had a dish towel. She looked at the floor at his hand at the shutoff he'd found. There's a hardware store on Route 36, she said. Opens at 7. I'll need solder and flux, and a pipe cutter if he doesn't have one. He has one. She came in and crouched and held out the towel. In the red toolbox on the, she stopped. He took the towel and wrapped his hand, and she didn't stand back up right away, and they were close on the cold floor, the water still sheeting slowly toward the drain, and he could hear from the dining room his daughter's voice, clear and unhurried, telling Deb Beaumont about the navigational habits of Arctic terns. In the red toolbox, he said. She nodded once, not looking at him. Okay, he said. He fixed the joint Sunday morning using Deb's tools, the pipe cutter, the old torch with the replacement tip, the flux that was still good, and Deb sat in the doorway of the utility room on a stool Trace had brought him, and handed things over when Silas asked and didn't speak otherwise, watching with the eyes of a man who has done this work and knows how it's done and cannot do it anymore, and is deciding how he feels about watching someone else do it correctly. At one point he said, "Cass brought a man here once before, lawyer from Cleveland. He called my truck a classic vehicle." "It's not old enough to be a classic," Silas said, from under the heater. "That's what I told him." A pause. He didn't stay long. Silas said nothing. He ran the bead, checked the joint, wiped the flux residue with a rag. "She designs things people use," Deb said. "She designs things that stand up. I figured that out. Took me a while." He was quiet a moment. "She doesn't bring people here who won't stand up." Silas turned the supply back on, a quarter turn, checked the joint. Dry. "That'll hold," he said. The drive back to Columbus was in the late afternoon light that Ohio sometimes produces in January, low and particular, and making the flat fields look almost intentional, like they'd been arranged rather than just left. Joni slept in the back before they'd cleared the Kashakton city limits. Cass rode with the window cracked 2 inches, her elbow on the sill, and didn't say anything for a long time. "Then I want to show you the library drawings, the project on the south side." She said it to the window. "I need someone who can read the original survey. The columns are in the wrong place on the as-builts, and I need eyes that know what they're looking at. I can look at it. I can pay you for your time." "You keep saying that." "Because I keep not knowing what else to offer," she said, and this was as unguarded as she'd been all weekend, the careful composure gone for a moment, just a woman in a car saying a true thing. He didn't answer right away. The highway ran out ahead of them, flat and straight, Columbus still an hour off. "My daughter talked more this weekend than she has since October," he said. Cass was quiet. I'm not trading you, I'm just telling you." He shifted in the seat. "She stopped talking after Miller died, not all the way, but most of the way." He kept his eyes on the road. "She was talking about turns at dinner. She hasn't talked about birds since the funeral." He felt rather than saw Cass look at him. "Your parents are good people," he said. "I know they are. Your dad's going to need that south slope graded before April. The drainage is wrong and a wet spring will take out whatever wall he puts in. I can come back and do it. You don't have to frame that as anything." She was looking at him directly now. He could feel it. "Silas." "Yeah. Why did you actually come this weekend?" He thought about it. The honest version of it, not the easy one. "Because Miller arranged it," he said, "and I've been standing still for 3 years and I was running out of reasons to keep doing that." She looked at the road a while. Then she reached over and put her hand palm down on the console between them, not quite touching his, not quite not, and left it there. He didn't move his hand either. Behind them Joni slept, one sock off, her book open on her chest to the page about migration. He got back to his place as dark was completing itself, the kind of full dark that comes early in January and sits on the land with a certain authority. He dropped Cass at her building and she'd stood on the sidewalk in the cold and said, "Tuesday, if you want to look at the drawings," and he'd said Tuesday, and that was the whole of it, and it was enough. He carried Joni in from the truck. She woke halfway, wrapped her arms around his neck without opening her eyes, the weight of her familiar and specific to him, that particular weight that nothing else in the world weighs. He put her in her bed and pulled the blanket up and stood there a moment in the dark of her room, listening to her breathe settle back into sleep. Then he went to the kitchen and stood at the sink and ran the water cold and washed his hands, the one with the dried cut from the copper and the one without, and dried them on the dish towel with the red stripe. Through the window the pasture was a dark plain under a sky that had cleared while he'd been driving, and there were stars, the first real stars in weeks, the cold having finally swept the cloud cover away the way cold does when it decides to stop apologizing. He heard a sound from outside. Not alarming, just the porch settling, the temperature dropping, the old boards doing what old boards do. He turned off the kitchen light and went to the front door and opened it. The cold came in fast and clean. The porch was empty in the way it had been empty since October. And then it wasn't, because there, shoved against the storm door frame, snow-lidded and rusted and exactly where it had been for 3 months, was Miller's red toolbox, and Silas stood in the doorway and looked at it, and the cold came through him, and something that had been cold longer than the weather was in it began, slowly, without announcement, to change state. He reached down and picked it up by the handle. The rust came off on his palm, orange and faint. The latch wire held. He carried it inside into the kitchen and set it in the corner under the window between the boots and the bin, and he did not put it away exactly, and he did not display it exactly. He set it down where things go when they belong somewhere. He turned the kitchen light back on. The house was warm. His daughter was asleep. Outside the window the stars were doing what stars do, which is simply to remain indifferent to everything, present without effort, as if staying were the easiest thing in the world. He stood in the middle of the kitchen floor. He did not go anywhere.